My name is Gerald Whitman, and I am 76 years old, though if you asked my daughter or my grandson, they would probably tell you I'm already half in the grave, an old relic clinging to the walls of a house that should have been emptied years ago, a house they say no longer belongs to a man like me, but to the new generation who knows better, who understands modern life and finances, who can turn memories into profit and clutter into investments. I live alone now, in the house my wife Margaret and I bought in 1972, a modest two-story wooden home with faded green shutters, a creaky porch swing that she used to sit on every evening in the spring, and a garden in the back where lilacs bloom every May, filling the air with a scent so rich it makes my chest ache with nostalgia. Margaret has been gone for 9 years now. Cancer took her in a cruel, quiet way, and since then the house has felt simultaneously too big and too small. Too big because of the silence that fills its rooms, too small because my memories overflow in every corner, pressing against me like restless ghosts. I wake early each morning, not out of discipline or desire to do much, but because sleep rarely stays with me anymore. I shuffle to the kitchen, leaning on the cane my doctor insists I use, though I prefer to think of it as a stick of dignity, a symbol that I still manage my own steps without anyone dragging me along. I make coffee the way Margaret once did, strong, dark, with just enough sugar to soften the bitterness, and sometimes I pour a second cup and set it across from me on the kitchen table, a foolish little habit that makes me feel less lonely, though I can already imagine my grandson rolling his eyes and calling me senile if he ever noticed it. After coffee, I read the newspaper. Yes, the printed one, though they laugh at me for subscribing, because I like the weight of it in my hands and the sound of the pages rustling, and because I cannot bear the constant glowing screens that they say are more efficient. My days pass quietly, though not without purpose. I tend to the garden as best I can, trimming roses, raking leaves, pulling weeds from the cracks in the driveway. Sometimes it takes me twice as long as it used to, my knees stiff, my back stubborn, but every small act feels like a way of keeping time from erasing me completely. Neighbors wave when they see me outside, and I wave back, though rarely do conversations last more than a few minutes. People are always in a hurry, running to work or errands, speaking quickly before rushing off, leaving me standing with my rake in hand, the words I had wanted to say dying on my lips. Afternoons are slower. I often sit in the living room where Margaret's rocking chair still faces the window, the same view she loved, the oak tree that changes with the seasons. I sometimes talk to her as if she was still there, my voice low and uncertain, asking her questions I know will never be answered. I'm not ashamed to say that I fear loneliness more than death. Death is simple, an ending, but loneliness stretches on and on, with no clear shape, just the endless echo of your own breathing in an empty room. That is why I still wait for visits from my family, though each time they come, I find myself bracing for disappointment. My daughter Linda is 50 now, a woman who has built her life on efficiency, on schedules, on calculating what things are worth in terms of dollars and investments, rather than in terms of memory or sentiment. She visits only when she feels obligated, usually with my grandson, Tyler, who is 17, tall, restless, already convinced that he knows everything worth knowing, impatient with the pace of the old, with the weight of tradition, with the fragility of someone like me. I love him. I cannot deny it, because he carries a piece of Margaret in his smile. But every time he walks into my house, I feel a storm of disdain wrapped in his casual words, the mockery hidden in his tone, the careless way he handles the things that have meant my whole life. It was not always like this. When Tyler was small, I adored him, and I thought he adored me. I remember teaching him to ride a bicycle on this very street, running behind him while he wobbled and nearly fell, his laughter ringing through the air when he finally balanced on his own. I remember us fishing at the lake, his small hands gripping the rod as he shouted with joy at catching his first sunfish. Those days I believed, perhaps foolishly, that the bond between us would carry into the future, that the child who called me grandpa with such warmth would grow into a young man who still had space in his heart for me. But adolescence arrived, and with it came distance, sarcasm, and a strange contempt I could never fully explain. My daughter rarely corrected him. Sometimes she even laughed at his jokes about me, saying, "Dad, don't take it personally. He's just a teenager." But there is a difference between harmless teasing and cruelty, and with each passing year, the cruelty became harder to ignore. Still, I tried to maintain hope. I told myself that families drift, but always return, that when Tyler was older, he would appreciate what I had given, what I had endured. I believed Linda would eventually soften, remembering her childhood, the bedtime stories I read her, the nights I worked late to pay for her piano lessons, the way I sat through every recital, proud even when she stumbled. Yet hope can be a dangerous thing at my age. It keeps you waiting at the window long after it becomes clear no one is coming. It keeps you polishing the silverware for dinners that will never happen. It keeps you setting 2 cups on the table, even though you know one will remain untouched. Recently, however, there has been a new undercurrent, something sharper, something that unsettles me. Linda has begun to speak more directly about my future, about the supposed impracticality of an old man living alone in a house like this, about how unsafe it is for me to manage stairs, about how much simpler life would be if I considered a retirement community. She uses words like practical, logical, sensible, but I hear only disposable. Tyler, meanwhile, has absorbed her tone and amplified it, making cruel little comments about how I won't need this house much longer, or how the best thing about retirement homes is that they recycle the furniture. I try to laugh it off, though it cuts deep, because to protest would only make me look weak, and weakness is what they expect. So here I remain, day after day, a man in a house full of echoes, clinging to rituals that keep me sane, but sensing that the ground beneath me is shifting, that something is coming I cannot prevent. I feel it in the way Linda pauses when she looks around the rooms, not as if she were visiting her father, but as if she were measuring square footage. I see it in Tyler's restless hands when he flips through my books without care, tossing them back on the shelf as though they were clutter, not the accumulated wisdom of a life. And I feel it in the heaviness that settles in my chest each night when I turn out the lights, when I ask Margaret silently whether I am a fool for holding on, for believing that love and respect are debts that cannot be erased. This is the world I inhabit at the beginning of my story. A quiet house that no longer feels safe, a family that no longer feels like family, and a man who has lived long enough to know that the greatest betrayals do not come from strangers, but from the ones you raised, the ones you loved, the ones who one day look at you and no longer see a father or a grandfather, but only an obstacle, something in the way of their plans, something they are willing to push aside. It was on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, one of those days when the weather seemed undecided, when the clouds gathered in slow formation but never quite released the rain, when the air felt heavy as if holding its breath, that my daughter Linda arrived unannounced with Tyler. I had been in the back garden pruning the roses, struggling with the clippers, bending slowly, careful not to let my knees betray me, when I heard the sound of a car door slamming, followed by laughter that did not belong to this house. At first, I felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps they had come simply to visit. Perhaps this would be the kind of day I'd been craving for years, when we might sit together in the living room and talk about simple things, share a meal, even remember Margaret with fondness rather than awkward silence. But that fragile hope began to dissolve the moment I saw the way Linda's eyes scanned the house. As she walked up the path, her gaze not soft with nostalgia, but sharp and calculating, as though she were appraising a property rather than stepping into her childhood home. She hugged me quickly, the way one greets a colleague, and Tyler gave me a half-smile, muttering, "Hey, Grandpa," with the flatness of someone forced to acknowledge a stranger. I invited them in, wiping my hands on my old gardening apron, apologizing for the soil under my fingernails, though neither seemed to care enough to reply. Inside, Linda immediately began moving through the rooms, touching the walls, glancing at the furniture, sighing as if the air itself carried some inconvenience. Tyler flopped onto the couch, pulling out his phone, his attention consumed by whatever glow held his interest, occasionally laughing at something on the screen, though never looking at me. "Dad," Linda began after a long silence, standing in the center of the living room as though she were about to deliver a lecture, "we really need to talk about your situation here. You're 76. You're alone most of the time, and this house, while lovely in its day, is not safe for you anymore. The stairs, the narrow bathroom doors, the outdated wiring, it's all just a recipe for disaster. I worry constantly that one day you'll trip, or there will be a fire, and no one will be here to help you. It's time we seriously consider moving you somewhere more practical, somewhere designed for people your age." I knew immediately what she meant, though she avoided the phrase, dressing it up in words like safety and practicality. But the truth was plain. She was speaking about a retirement home. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought of Margaret, of the way she had fought so hard to preserve the dignity of her final days, insisting she would not be confined to a sterile place that smelled of antiseptic and resignation, insisting she would die in the house she had built with me, surrounded by her books and her garden. I tried to steady my voice, to keep it calm, though I could hear a tremor slipping through. "Linda," I said, "I've lived here for nearly 50 years. This is my home, your home once, the place where you took your first steps, where you played the piano in the corner until your fingers ached. I'm not leaving it for some institution where strangers tell me when to eat and when to sleep." She sighed, the kind of sigh that dismisses entire lifetimes of sentiment, and shook her head. "Dad, you're being unreasonable. You can't cling to memories forever. You need to think about what's best for you, and frankly, what's best for us too. We can't be constantly worried about you living here alone." I noticed then that she had placed a glossy folder on the coffee table, its cover decorated with cheerful photographs of smiling grey-haired people playing cards or exercising in pastel-colored rooms. I picked it up reluctantly, flipping through the pages, seeing pictures of spotless dining halls in neatly made beds, all so perfect and sterile that it made me shiver. My daughter watched me closely, her eyes gleaming not with concern but with anticipation, as if waiting for me to admit defeat. Tyler, meanwhile, stretched out his legs on the couch, glanced at the brochure, and chuckled. "Honestly, Grandpa, it doesn't look that bad. Kind of like a hotel, right? You'd probably get used to it, and hey, you'd have people your age to hang out with. You could swap war stories or knitting tips or whatever you old guys do." He laughed at his own joke, shaking his head as though the very idea of me being anything other than a burden was laughable. My face burned, but I forced myself to remain composed, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me wounded. The conversation grew heavier as Linda pressed her point. She spoke about finances, about how keeping the house was costly, about maintenance and utilities, about the impracticality of leaving a property like this to decay. She used phrases like liquidating assets and long-term planning, words that felt cold and clinical, words that revealed what she truly meant. She was already thinking about what would happen after I was gone, already calculating how my death could be converted into financial advantage. I tried to interject, to remind her of what the house meant, but every time I spoke she cut me off with a tone that carried both irritation and superiority, as if she were scolding a child who refused to eat his vegetables. At one point, Tyler finally put his phone down, looked me directly in the eye, and said with startling bluntness, "Grandpa, come on. You don't need this house. You can't even keep up with it. You should just move out and let Mom handle it. She'll know what to do. You're just holding on to stuff that doesn't matter anymore. Sooner or later, you're going to have to accept that you're not young and that you can't live here forever." He said it with a kind of casual cruelty. Not shouting, not even angry, just matter of fact, as if the decision were obvious and my resistance nothing more than stubbornness. I felt something collapse inside me in that moment, though I tried not to show it. Here was the boy I once carried on my shoulders, the boy who once fell asleep against my chest as I read him bedtime stories, now speaking of my life as though it were an obstacle, as though my existence were a piece of furniture that needed to be moved out of the way. Linda nodded approvingly at his words, as though proud that her son had the same clarity of vision, the same pragmatism she believed she possessed. Together, they stood on one side of the room, and I felt myself shrinking on the other, a lone figure surrounded not by family, but by people who had already begun erasing me from their plans. They stayed for less than an hour after that, long enough for Linda to leave me with the brochures, insisting that I sleep on it and be reasonable. Long enough for Tyler to wander upstairs into my study and remark on how dusty everything was. Long enough to remind me that I was no longer master of my own story, but rather a character waiting for others to decide his fate. When they finally left, the house seemed even quieter than usual, as though it too had been judged and condemned, as though its walls knew that they were now just numbers in an equation rather than witnesses to a lifetime. I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the second cup of coffee I had poured for Margaret, which had gone cold, untouched, just like me. The brochures lay spread out before me, their glossy images taunting me with a future I refused to accept, a future that smelled not of lilacs or roses, but of bleach and resignation. My daughter's words echoed in my mind, and Tyler's casual contempt replayed itself again and again, and I realized that the foundation of my world had shifted. This was not just a conversation about safety or practicality. It was the first open declaration that my life, as it was, no longer belonged to me. A week after that visit, when the air between us had already been poisoned by words I could not forget, Linda called to say that she and Tyler would be stopping by again, this time to help me with a few things around the house. I did not ask for help, nor did I want it, but the way she phrased it made it sound less like an offer and more like a declaration, as though my home were already half theirs, a place they could enter and rearrange as they pleased. I spent that morning trying to put the rooms in order, polishing the wooden banister that Margaret had loved to run her hand across, dusting the shelves, even vacuuming the worn carpet in the living room, though the machine rattled so badly I feared it might break apart in my hands. I wanted the house to look like a place of dignity, not the decaying space they already imagined it to be. But deep down I knew nothing I did would change the way they saw me. When they arrived, Linda carried a stack of plastic storage boxes, the kind you buy when you want to empty a life into labeled compartments, and Tyler carried nothing at all, walking inside as though the place already belonged to him. He immediately kicked off his shoes and stretched himself across the couch, scrolling through his phone with the air of a landlord inspecting his tenant. Linda smiled tightly. That smile she uses when she thinks she is being kind, but in fact is reminding you of her authority, and said, "Dad, we thought it would be good to start going through some of your things. You know, decluttering, getting rid of the old stuff that just takes up space. It'll make it easier for you. And when the time comes," she caught herself, but the pause hung heavy in the air, "it will make everything more manageable." I wanted to protest, but before I could find the words, Tyler had already pulled one of my old photo albums off the shelf, flipping through the pages with careless fingers, smirking at the black and white images of family picnics, Margaret in her wide-brimmed hat, Linda as a child holding a toy doll. "Wow, Mom, look at this," he said with a laugh, turning the book around so she could see. "Grandpa actually used to have hair, and you look like some kind of farm kid." No wonder you hate these old pictures. They make you look poor. Linda gave a small chuckle, the kind that is half embarrassed, half condescending, and said, "Tyler, be respectful," though the way she said it carried no weight, no rebuke, just a performative reminder, as though she were checking a box on a parenting list. I felt my stomach tighten as I walked over and gently took the album from his hands, closing it carefully, holding it against my chest as though shielding Margaret herself from his mockery. "These are not just old pictures," I said, my voice trembling more with grief than anger. "They are memories, they are our lives, and they are not for you to laugh at." Tyler rolled his eyes, muttered something about old people being too sensitive, and returned to his phone. Linda, however, pressed forward with her mission, opening closets, pulling out coats that had hung untouched since Margaret's passing, holding them up and saying things like, "Do you really need this, Dad? Wouldn't it be better to donate? Someone else could get more use out of it than you." I watched helplessly as she made piles, one for charity, one for the trash, and occasionally one she set aside with a subtle gleam in her eye, the pile I knew would end up in her own home. Every item she touched seemed to erase a part of me. When she reached the shelf where Margaret's porcelain figurines stood, the delicate little birds and angels she had collected over decades, each one chosen carefully during trips or anniversaries, I felt my breath catch. Linda picked one up, turned it in her hand, and said, "Honestly, Dad, these are just dust collectors. Tyler almost knocked one over just now. Why not box them up or sell them?" "You can't take them with you." I took the figurine from her hand and placed it back with deliberate care, my voice low but firm. "Your mother loved these. They stay where they are." Linda pursed her lips, clearly annoyed but unwilling to fight that particular battle in that moment. Instead, she moved to the kitchen where she began opening cabinets, commenting on the outdated dishes, the chipped mugs, the old kettle I still used every morning. Tyler followed her in, opening the refrigerator and laughing at the sight of leftovers I'd been saving. "What's this, Grandpa?" he asked, holding up a container of stew. "This looks like it's older than me." "No wonder you're always complaining about your stomach. You eat this garbage." I told him to put it back, but he twisted the lid off and poured the stew into the trash, making a show of holding his nose as though it were toxic. Linda glanced at me with a mixture of pity and irritation, as though she saw me not as a man maintaining his home, but as a child incapable of looking after himself. "Dad, we're only trying to help," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut through any illusion of kindness. "You can't keep living like this. If you won't agree to the retirement community, at least let us clear out some of this mess. It's unhealthy, it's unsafe, and frankly, it's selfish to expect us to worry about you when you won't take responsibility." The word selfish struck me like a slap. Me, who had spent my life working double shifts so she could have piano lessons, me who had given her the down payment for her first house, me who had sacrificed vacations, new clothes, even simple pleasures so that she could go to college without debt. To be called selfish by the very child I had loved and provided for felt like a cruel joke, and yet I could not summon the words to throw back at her. Instead, I retreated into silence, clutching the back of a chair for balance, my body trembling with a mixture of rage and sorrow. The rest of that afternoon unfolded like a slow humiliation. Tyler wandered upstairs and returned with a box of my old letters. Correspondence from friends now long gone, notes Margaret had written me in the early years of our marriage, and waved them in the air like relics from another civilization. "Do you even remember what's in these?" he asked mockingly. "You probably don't. You forget half the stuff I tell you anyway. Maybe we should just toss them. They're just paper." I snatched the box from him, my hands shaking, my voice barely more than a whisper. "These are my life," I said, but he had already turned away, smirking as though my words were nothing more than the ramblings of an old fool. By the time they finally left, taking with them 3 boxes of clothes and dishes they insisted were for donation, the house felt stripped, not just of objects, but of its very spirit. The rooms seemed smaller, emptier, colder. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the spaces where things once stood, and I realized that this was only the beginning. They had crossed a threshold, moved from suggestion to action, from words to deeds, and I had allowed it. My authority over my own home had been undermined, and my grandson had spoken to me not as family, but as a usurper, waiting for me to fall. That night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, I thought of the way Tyler had laughed while holding my letters, the way Linda had dismissed Margaret's figurines, the way they had called me selfish for clinging to what little still anchored me to this world. I felt a deep unease settle in my chest, heavier than the weight of age, heavier even than grief. It was the knowledge that this was not just about clutter, not just about safety, but about erasure, about a slow dismantling of my life while I was still alive to watch it. And I knew, though I could not yet admit it aloud, that worse was coming, that the day would arrive when they would not simply suggest I move aside, but would demand it, and that I would have to decide whether to yield or to resist in the only ways left to me. The breaking point came on a grey afternoon when Linda announced that she and Tyler would be coming over to help move some furniture. I had not asked for furniture to be moved, and my back, though stiff, was not yet broken, but she insisted that it was necessary, that the heavy oak cabinet in the hallway was a hazard, that the arrangement of the living room was impractical, that change was not only preferable, but inevitable. I knew better than to argue, because when Linda arrived with that determined set in her jaw, no resistance of mine ever seemed to matter. Tyler followed her into the house with the swagger of someone entering enemy territory already conquered, his eyes sweeping the walls and floors as if calculating their value, his footsteps loud and careless, his energy impatient and scornful. They had already decided what would be moved before I even understood the plan. Linda ordered Tyler to take the armchair, Margaret's armchair, the one where she had sat every evening of her last years, and push it toward the far wall. I objected. My voice strained, reminding them that it was not just an armchair, that it was a part of her, that I liked it where it stood because I could still see her there in memory. Linda shook her head in that exasperated way, as though I were a stubborn child refusing to tidy his room, and said that nostalgia could not dictate safety, that the room needed to be more open. Tyler smirked as he grabbed the chair, muttering under his breath that it smelled like old lady dust. I stood there, my hands trembling on my cane, watching him drag the chair with no reverence, no hesitation, and I felt as though something sacred were being defiled before my eyes. But it was what came next that etched itself into my bones. They decided to move the oak cabinet, the one Margaret and I had bought early in our marriage, a solid piece of furniture that had held our dishes, our family photographs, and later, after she passed, the keepsakes I could not bear to part with. Tyler braced himself against it, eager to display his strength, while Linda instructed me to stand aside, her tone firm, commanding, leaving no room for dignity, as Tyler pushed and pulled. The cabinet shifted unevenly, its weight awkward, its footing unstable on the old hardwood floor. He grunted, straining, his teenage bravado colliding with the reality of an object heavier than his pride anticipated. Then, in that moment, when the cabinet teetered slightly and he barked at me, "Move, or I'll move you," something inside me hardened. The words were not a joke. Not teenage sarcasm, but an order, a dismissal, a threat wrapped in youthful arrogance. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time I saw not my grandson, not the boy who had once held my hand with trust, but an adversary who saw me as an obstacle, who would sooner push me aside than acknowledge my worth. In that instant, my body chose before my mind did. I stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of a grim, silent defiance, a refusal to be pushed like a piece of furniture. And as I shifted my weight away from his path, Tyler's foot caught on the edge of the rug, his balance wavered, and with a startled cry that still echoes in my ears, he fell backward down the short staircase that led to the lower landing. The thud of his body striking wood was sickening, sharp, final in its sound, followed by a silence so heavy it seemed to smother the air itself. Linda screamed, rushing toward him, her voice shrill with panic, calling his name, shaking him as if she could undo gravity itself. He groaned, his face twisted in pain, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, and for a long moment I could not move, my hand gripping the door frame, my breath caught somewhere between horror and a strange, cold inevitability. I had not touched him, had not lifted a hand against him, and yet it was my choice, my deliberate decision not to intervene, that had let him fall. When the ambulance came, the house filled with the wail of sirens, the rush of strangers in uniforms, the chaotic energy of emergency. I stood in the corner, forgotten, while Linda wept and barked frantic answers to the paramedics, her voice accusing even in its desperation. Tyler was carried out on a stretcher, pale, trembling, gasping through clenched teeth as they stabilized his leg, and in his eyes, for one fleeting second, I thought I saw not just pain, but hatred, as though he already blamed me for stepping aside. After they left, after the noise faded and the house sank back into silence, Linda turned on me with a fury I'd never seen in her before. "How could you just stand there?" she demanded, her face blotched with tears and anger. "He told you to move because you were in the way. You could have helped him, steadied the cabinet, caught him. But you just stepped aside and let him fall. Don't you understand? He could have been killed." Her voice shook with rage, but beneath it I heard something else, an accusation that reached beyond the fall, an accusation that I was already guilty of being old, of being useless, of being a man whose existence endangered, rather than protected. I tried to explain that I had not meant for him to fall, that it had happened too quickly, that he had been reckless, that his words had cut through me in a way I could not explain. But she would not hear it. She turned away, gathering her coat, muttering that she had known this house was dangerous, that I had been too stubborn to see reason, that now Tyler was suffering because of me. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the same room where Margaret's chair sat displaced, where the cabinet leaned awkwardly against the wall, where the air still carried the echo of Tyler's threat and his fall. That night I did not sleep. I sat in the dim light of the living room, staring at the empty space where the accident had unfolded, my mind replaying it over and over, searching for the exact second where I could have done differently, where I could have reached out, where I could have been the grandfather they wanted me to be, rather than the man who stepped aside. And yet, each time I replayed it, I felt the same chilling truth. I had chosen not to intervene, not to protect him, not to absorb yet another insult to my dignity. For once, I had chosen myself. And though guilt gnawed at me, though fear whispered of what Linda might say to others, though I imagined the accusations that might come, there was also something darker, something I dared not name, a quiet, unsettling relief, as though fate had delivered its own judgment in my silence. The days following Tyler's fall blurred into a heavy haze of unease, a silence that stretched longer than any silence I had known before. The house itself seemed unsettled, its walls carrying the memory of the thud, the scream, the sirens. I tried to distract myself with ordinary tasks, watering the garden, polishing the kitchen table, sorting through my books, but each motion felt hollow, as if I were moving through a dream I could not wake from. I waited for news, waited for a phone call from Linda, but none came, and with each passing hour, the weight of her absence grew heavier, feeding a fear I did not want to name, that she was not merely angry, not merely hurt, but plotting, preparing, something far more dangerous than silence. When the call finally came, it was not from Linda but from a doctor at the hospital. He told me that Tyler had undergone surgery for his broken leg, that the operation had been successful, but that recovery would be long and difficult. He spoke with the detached professionalism of someone delivering neutral facts, but in his tone I detected a subtle hesitation, as though he had been instructed to tell me no more than the bare minimum. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and sat staring at the receiver, realizing that Linda had not wanted me to hear the news directly from her. That omission, small on the surface, felt monumental, a sign that a deeper wedge had been driven between us. The next day, she appeared at my door. Her knock was not the soft, uncertain knock of a daughter visiting her father, but the hard, deliberate pounding of someone announcing authority. When I opened the door, she did not step inside immediately. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, her expression tight with restrained fury, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel as though I were the one who had committed a crime. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold, each word clipped like the snapping of a thread. I nodded and stepped aside, but even as she entered, I felt that it was no longer my home, but a courtroom, and she the prosecutor preparing to deliver her case. She began, without preamble. "Tyler could have died, Dad. He's in pain every hour, and he may not fully recover for months. Do you understand the seriousness of this? Do you realize how close he came to being paralyzed? And all because you couldn't bring yourself to help. You stood there and let him fall. What kind of grandfather does that?" Her voice trembled, not with sorrow, but with rage sharpened into accusation. I tried to defend myself, tried to explain that Tyler had been reckless, that he had ordered me aside, that the fall was an accident born of his own arrogance, but she cut me off with a wave of her hand, her face twisted in disdain. "Don't you dare try to blame him. He's a child. He's 17. He doesn't know better. You're the adult, the elder, the one who should have taken responsibility. Instead, you stepped aside like a coward and let him shatter his leg." The word coward struck deeper than I could admit, because part of me had wondered the same in the sleepless nights since the fall. Was my choice to step aside born of dignity, of self-preservation, or was it simply weakness, the refusal to act? Her accusation burrowed into me, but alongside it rose another feeling, bitter and sharp. Anger at being reduced to nothing but the villain in a story where I had given so much, where my sacrifices were invisible, where every act of love had been erased by this one moment of silence. She pressed on, her words relentless. "I've spoken to a lawyer. He says that given your condition, your age, your health, your memory lapses, it wouldn't be difficult to have you declared unfit to live alone. He says we could pursue guardianship, which would allow us to make decisions on your behalf, decisions you clearly can't make for yourself anymore. This house, your finances, your medical care, it could all be placed under proper supervision. And after what happened with Tyler, don't think for a second that a judge wouldn't agree. You're a danger to yourself and to others. You can't be trusted." At that moment, the air seemed to leave the room. I felt my knees weaken, not from age, but from the sheer force of her betrayal. Guardianship. Such a clinical word. Yet behind it lay a plan as cruel as any punishment. To strip me of control, to reduce me to a ward in my own life, to erase my authority and hand it to the very people who saw me as nothing more than a burden. My daughter, my only child, the girl I had raised and loved, was now threatening to erase me legally, to render me powerless in the eyes of the world. I tried to speak, but my voice cracked under the weight of grief and fury. "Linda, I am not incompetent. My mind is clear. I manage my life, my bills, my house. I do not need your guardianship. What you want is not protection. It's control. You want this house, my savings, my freedom, and you're using Tyler's accident as your excuse." Her eyes flashed with something that was not guilt, but irritation at being seen so clearly. She stepped closer, lowering her voice, her words like venom. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you see through me. But the truth is, Dad, you're old, and the old don't win. The old get pushed aside and no one will care. Not the courts, not the neighbors, not even your so-called friends. You're already half gone, and the sooner you realize that, the easier this will be." For a long moment, I simply stared at her, unable to reconcile the child I remembered with the woman who now stood before me. I thought of the nights I had carried her feverish body to the doctor, the mornings I had packed her school lunches, the years I had labored at work so she could have a chance at a life better than mine. And here she was, stripping me down to nothing, not even a father anymore, just a legal problem to be solved, a stumbling block in the way of her inheritance. But it did not end there. A few days later, I received a call from the bank asking for confirmation about a request to access one of my accounts. Confused, I went into person, only to discover that Linda had already tried to withdraw a large sum, claiming she had authority to manage my finances due to my declining mental state. The manager, whom I had known for years, had refused without my explicit consent. But the attempt alone chilled me to my core. She was not just threatening guardianship, she was already laying the groundwork, already presenting herself as the caretaker of a man she insisted was incapable. The humiliation deepened when neighbors began to ask subtle questions. One stopped me at the mailbox and asked gently if I was doing all right, mentioning that Linda had told her I was becoming forgetful, that I sometimes left the stove on, that I had wandered outside in the middle of the night confused. None of it was true, but the pity in the neighbor's eyes burned worse than if she had accused me outright. It was clear. Linda was building a case, crafting a narrative of my decline, spreading seeds of doubt so that when the time came, the world would already believe I was failing. Even Tyler, recovering in his cast, played his part. When I visited him at the hospital, he refused to meet my gaze, staring instead at the television as though I were invisible. Finally, he muttered, "Mom says you just stood there and watched. She says you didn't even care if I died. Is that true, Grandpa? Did you just let me fall because you wanted to?" His words pierced me more than any lawyer's threat, because behind them was not only accusation, but a seed of belief, planted by Linda, nurtured by her whispers, turning my own grandson against me. Forever, I left the hospital that day with a heaviness I could barely carry. The betrayal was complete. My daughter had turned my love into weakness, my grandson into an enemy, my dignity into evidence against me. And yet, beneath the despair, another feeling began to stir, a quiet, steady determination. If they were willing to erase me, then I would not go quietly. If they wanted to take my house, my freedom, my life, then I would fight, not with fists or shouting, but with the resolve of a man who still knew who he was, who still remembered the truth, who still believed that even in old age, dignity is not. Surrendered but defended. I did not sleep the night before the conversation because I understood that whatever I said would either end the slow erasure of my life or seal it. And so I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and the house breathing its old wooden breath, and I sorted papers into 3 neat stacks, one for the bank, one for the lawyer, one for the doctor, touching each page as if it were a talisman, reminding myself that in a world where my words had begun to count for less, signatures and seals and dates still had weight. In the morning, I dressed in my best jacket, the one Margaret liked because it made me stand straighter, and I drove myself deliberately, carefully, without the tremor Linda had been whispering about, to the hospital where Tyler was recovering, and I asked the nurse to tell my daughter I was downstairs. When she came into the cafeteria, she came with a look I had never seen so perfectly arranged on her face, a blend of martyrdom and impatience and triumph, as if she were about to preside over an intervention, as if I were a bottle that needed to be corked and stored on the proper shelf. I did not ask her to sit. I opened the envelope and placed the first stack between us, the letter from Dr. Ramey, the geriatrician who had examined me for 2 hours and then sent me for neurocognitive testing with a specialist who did not smile once, and both had written in unambiguous language that my memory, reasoning, and executive functioning were intact for my age, that I managed my own medications and finances appropriately, that I was not in need of guardianship or supervision. I let Linda read the lines, watched the way her eyes tried to skim past the conclusions, as if speed could blur verdict, and when she lifted her head to say those doctors didn't know me the way she did, I slid forward the second stack, the bank forms revoking any informal access, the notarized affidavit from the branch manager detailing her attempt to withdraw funds while asserting a decline that did not exist, the freeze I had placed on any third-party authority, the new passwords and the safe deposit box key that would not be duplicated for anyone. She did not reach for the papers. She reached for the old weapon of tone, saying that money was not the point, that safety was, that love was, that the house was dangerous and I was stubborn, and perhaps she might have continued along those rails, building speed toward the cliff where she imagined I would leap in guilt, but I touched the third stack lightly, the one tied with Margaret's blue ribbon, and told her we were going to talk about the house now, not as an idea or a burden or a future windfall, but as a legal fact already changed, and before she could open her mouth, I said that 2 days earlier I had executed a deed transferring the property into an irrevocable trust, bearing Margaret's name, that the trust appointed a professional fiduciary, someone she had never met and would never be able to charm or threaten, and that upon my death the house would not be sold for anyone's convenience, but would pass to the town library to fund a reading room for children who did not have grandparents to read to them at night, and to Meals on Wheels, because Margaret had once said that no one should be old and hungry on our street. I watched the color drain from my daughter's face, not because she loved the house the way I did, but because she finally understood that the arithmetic she had been doing in private had lost its numbers. She reached for fury and found none of it, would stick to the documents between us, and so she reached for pity, saying I had acted rashly, saying a man in grief should not make irrevocable decisions, saying we could discuss modifications, and I told her with a calm I felt down in my bones that there would be no modifications because for once in the long history of our family I had done something that could not be overturned by her impatience or her strategies, that I had chosen the memory of a woman who treated love like a promise over the appetite of a daughter who treated love like a lever. She tried to change the battleground by invoking Tyler, the boy who had fallen because I moved, the boy in pain upstairs, the boy whose text messages, I later learned, turned my name into a punchline, and she said that whatever I thought I had suffered could not compare to what he was enduring because of me, and I said that suffering did not rank like medals, that pain was not a contest, but that since we were speaking in the language of cause and effect, I had brought something for him as well, and I laid on the table a single page, a letter addressed to my grandson, telling him that I had established a small scholarship at the community college in Margaret's name to be awarded each year to a first-generation student who worked evenings, because my wife had worked evenings when Linda was small and I'd seen what it took, and that I had placed Tyler's name on the first donation, not as a beneficiary, but as the reason, a public note that said this gift was made in honor of a young man who would learn that strength is not measured by the weight you shove, but by the weight you choose to carry, and that when he was ready to talk to me as a man to a man, I would be here. I watched my daughter's mouth open in disbelief, because she had expected either vengeance or surrender, not that unfashionable combination of judgment and mercy. And for a brief second I recognized the little girl she had been, the one who cried when stories ended where kindness had been possible. She recovered quickly, because she always did, and said something about lawyers and contesting an undue influence and the ridiculousness of donating a perfectly good house to strangers when flesh and blood had needs. And I told her that flesh and blood were not bonds, that they were biology, and that the only bonds that mattered at the end were the ones woven from acts repeated until they became a kind of trust, and that she had broken that trust so often that even the house, dumb wood and plaster that it was, seemed to flinch when she crossed its threshold. She called me cruel, called me theatrical, called me unwell, and I let the words drift past like gnats because I had brought one last thing, a small recorder the size of a thumb that the neighbor's boy had helped me purchase, and which I had placed on the hallway table the day they came to move the oak cabinet, not as a trap, but as a witness for me, and I pressed play, and there, amid the scrape of wood and the grunts of effort, came Tyler's voice clear as a bell, the line that had been eating me. From the inside since it was spoken, "Move or I'll move you," and then a scuffle, a stumble, a hard tumble followed by Linda's cry, not because I wanted to humiliate them, but because I wanted the truth to sit at the table with us for once. Something other than the stories she told neighbors and Banks and herself, and when the recording ended, there was a wide, clean silence in which I could feel my own heart beat for the first time in weeks. I told her then, in a voice that did not rise, that I had retained an elder law attorney who would respond to any petition she filed with the full weight of the assessments and the bank affidavit and the recording, that I had met with a social worker and filed a report about attempted financial exploitation, not to punish her, but to place a marker in the file in case she decided to grow bolder, that I had changed the locks on the house and left a key with the fiduciary, that I had already arranged a short-term rental in a quiet complex where the manager promised to fix a leaky faucet without telling me I was too old to notice, and that I would be moving out in a week, not because I had been pushed, but because I was stepping aside from the version of family that confused ownership with love. I told her I would not visit Tyler until he wanted to see me, that I would not answer questions about money or property, that I would not stand in any more rooms where my history was treated like clutter, and that if she wanted a father in her life, she would have to learn the difference between care and control, between planning and plunder, between being my daughter and being my warden. For a moment, she simply stared, and the part of me that had always waited for her to remember the soft-eyed man who had tied her skates and watched her wobble into winter hoped she might put her hand over mine and say she was sorry, that grief had made her hard, that fear had made her cruel, that love could be relearned. Instead, she pushed back her chair and said that I would die alone and that Charity would not come sit at my bedside, and I said, very gently, that neither would greed and that if solitude was the price of dignity, then I would pay it with both hands, because I had been preparing my whole life to meet Margaret again with my head unbowed. When she left, she did not slam the door, and that felt, strangely, like a small mercy. I carried the papers home and placed them in the drawer of the oak cabinet, which I righted that afternoon by myself. Slowly, inch by inch, the way you write anything that has been tipped too long, with patience, with weight where it belongs, with the knowledge that balance is not given but made. I moved out a week later the way a man eases himself into cold water, slowly and without spectacle, taking only what I could carry in 3 trips down the stairs, the framed photograph of Margaret on our first spring in the house, the box of letters that smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the cookbook with her penciled notes in the margins, and the small radio that still catches the ball games through a friendly haze. The rest I left to the trust and time, closing the door behind me with the quiet certainty that the house would survive me in a way I could respect. The apartment surprised me by not being a step down but a step sideways, a second-floor corner with a railing that looked toward a pond where geese held their slow arguments at dusk. Neighbors who nodded from their thresholds without asking what I owned or what I would leave them, and a manager who fixed a sticky window in 20 minutes and then asked me about Margaret as if he were setting a chair for her at the table. I learned the new noises and the new light, the way morning puddles on the kitchen tile like a patient lake, the way a night breeze turns the blinds into an instrument, and I set my days in order. Coffee for 1, walks at 9 when the air is cleanest, a chair under the maple by noon with a library book and the soft permission to read the same page twice, and on Thursdays, a bus to the old downtown where I volunteer an hour at the children's section and read aloud from the books Margaret loved, because if a person cannot carry a house forward, he can at least carry its voice. Linda called twice from numbers my phone did not recognize, and I did not answer, and when she sent a letter that spoke about pain and fairness and the coldness of legalese, I wrote back in my slow hand that I would speak with her gladly whenever we could talk without money between us like a third person, that I would meet her in a church or a park or a diner with cracked vinyl, that I would listen longer than I spoke if she could promise not to turn my life into a ledger. I sealed the envelope. Without triumph, walked it to the blue mailbox by the bus stop, and felt a small piece that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with drawing a line that even I could keep. The trust papers settled like a flock coming to ground. Records filed and keys exchanged, and a calendar date circled for the library plaque. And I began to understand that dignity is not a feeling but a posture, something you hold even when no one is watching. A way of saying to the world, I am still here in the shape I choose. The opening of the children's reading room arrived on a Saturday, bright enough to make strangers gentle, a crowd of mothers and grandmothers and a few fathers holding strollers like shields, a ribbon stretched across the doorway that made me think, not for the first time, how many things in this country begin with scissors. A librarian with a velvet voice thanked donors in the general way institutions must, and when she said Margaret's name, the room turned its head toward me, as if the sound were a bird, and I rose and nodded and did not speak because this was not a day for speeches, but for use. I read the first story to a floor of small listeners who interrupted bravely with questions, and when I finished, a boy asked if the lady in the picture frame on the table was my wife and if she liked cookies, and I said yes to both, and the room laughed the good laugh that gives more than it takes, and I felt, for the first time in years, that I had not only kept a promise, but made one. I was packing the books back on their cart when Tyler came in on a crutch he mostly carried rather than used, taller than my memory of him, and paler, with a look I had not seen since he was 10, and lost his laces under a couch, a look that asked for help without knowing how to ask. He stood beside the plaque as if it might read him back, then drifted to my table and said my name, the way a person tries the temperature of water with a finger, and I said his name back, and we let the air be what it was. He did not apologize with words because boys rarely do. But he spoke about the physical therapist who told him that strength will return if he is disciplined. He spoke about nights when pain makes a person reasonable. He spoke about watching recording once alone and once with his mother and hearing his voice come back at him like a cold door. And when he said he was ashamed, he didn't look at me but at the book cart, which was apology enough. He asked, in a voice that avoided pride like a pothole, whether the scholarship with his name on it meant he could take a writing class at the community college because the fall ended the season and his chances, and he didn't know what came next, and I told him that the letter was not an accusation, but an invitation, that the gift was his to pass on by becoming someone who made gifts of himself, that he was welcome to walk with me to the diner across from the bus stop where the coffee is better than you expect, and that we could talk there about stories that begin with falling and end with standing anyway. We ate with the uneasy concentration of men who both want to mend and fear being mended. And before he left, he reached into his jacket and handed me the bicycle bell I had once mounted on the blue Schwinn. And he said he had kept it for a long time, because he liked the sound, and I turned it in my hand, and did not need to ring it, because in that moment, something small inside us had already been heard. Now the days move in their lane, steady and unremarkable in the way that makes life possible, the geese yelling their philosophies at sunrise, Silas downstairs arguing with his radio, the Thursday bus arriving with a sigh that sounds like forgiveness, and sometimes, not every week, but often enough, Tyler meets me at the library and sits in the back while I read. And afterward he carries boxes without making a ceremony of it. We do not talk about the cabinet or the stairs or the sentence that broke the year in half, because some things are better repaired by hands than by words, and if that is cowardice, then it is the kind that builds rather than hides. I still set 2 cups on the table some mornings, and I still talk to Margaret about the weather and the price of eggs and what the children liked best from the story hour. And sometimes I bring the 2nd cup to the maple and pour it at the roots, because love should go on doing some good in the ground. Linda has not answered my letter, and perhaps she never will, and perhaps time will bring her to a bench I can bear, and if it does, I will sit with her and keep my hands open, but I no longer live in the ache of a door that does not knock. I think, more often than I admit, about the day Tyler said move or I'll move you, and the way I stepped aside. And I understand now that what looked like retreat was the first true step forward, that a man can remove himself from the path of contempt and still not abandon anyone, that stepping aside is not surrender when it clears a place for something honest to walk through. If the end comes with no one in the room but the maple and the geese and the librarian shelving the last book of the day, I will not call that loneliness. I will call it a house made of the right kind of quiet, a room where a life can sit down and rest. And if there is a final sentence to be spoken about me, let it be this. I did not move the boy. I moved myself. And in doing so, I found the straightest way back to being a person.